Recognizing who you aren't is recognizing who you are. Is knowing exactly we come into our own set position and set lines and calculations, screen lines. The most powerful thing for us to recognize is who we really aren't, is that's what we focus on. The more you focus on who you aren't, you start to recognize who you really are. And the more you get in positions, the more it comes in balance. I know it seems strange, but it's actually the inner set locations that you understand. It's the inner system that you are. It's the outer systems that you have to recognize. Inner set location, outer set position of all those set position, how you see it, the reflection or refraction or location. It's everything which is the outside setting. It's everything which is the negative cycle. That is the position that we all live in, is the void itself, which is the empty space itself. But how we identify that is truly how we see ourselves through the inner space that we are and the outer space that we have to understand. It's the outer space, not the inner space. But see, this is the thing. We live in outer space, but we are the inner space. So what we have to identify is what goes on through its vision and cortex and understand how to see that ourselves through our own animations that we are. We are animators drawing structures of design line. We come into vision, we come into cortex, right? We're sending out signals. Okay, that's an out setting. Inside is receiving, transmitting out, receiving in. Okay, so when you're transmitting out and you're receiving in, it's together, right? So you process when you get in position of space. Instead of the vision, the cortex, the theta, the data, line communication, imagination, what you created. Then it comes into the inner space of who you are. Then you see it in real time. You're bringing things to life. So you're taking an animation in process of communication and bringing it to life. Okay? Now, how you bring it to life. Now, this is the trick that you have to understand the operators and units. You have to get out of the one graph, a three-dimensional mind. The process that to get back in position locations. Change the frequencies, how you see yourself in three dimension. Time sequence times calculation times pi. Process lines a 7 paradigm in a three-dimensional graph. And that's what you come back to. That's right. You come back to 7 signals in that position. Not 3, 7. 7 paradigm, 3 graph body. Now, how to use that information setting is from the grounds up, grounds, powers, and apps. To get you into positions how the team and the units and everybody else has to identify these things. That starts to make sense. Start to recognize that. But you have to understand the frequencies of you first, which is not anything of not what you aren't. It's what you're identifying, what you always are, as who you see yourself, as the now. And I did that 12-minute video, process that position location through its system, all through attractions. Also, too, I want to identify in that position locations. I don't want anybody to get the wrong idea when I say in positions for you to reference me of who I am and who I'm not. We're in a story of itself, and that's who we have to identify. But I don't want to confuse anybody who we aren't in that positions. I know I'm in set positions of who I'm not and identify who I always am, just myself, right? How I see myself is reference to me. But we have to understand how we reference everything else. And that's where it comes into chain of command and protocol. It's just how you commit yourself to yourself. This has nothing to do with the team until you identify yourself as the team. You don't become yourself until you understand yourself. Then you become the team, right? Then you are the team. There's no I in team, right? I doesn't exist. Now, if I doesn't exist, it's how you bring into existence. That's what exists. How you perceive through consciousness. But to identify that you're always in the VR system, constantly understanding what you're doing is respecting the void, but understanding you is the inner cycles of you, okay? That's who you are, is the inner space. Outer space is respecting the outer space, which is the negative. The connection setting the positive, the negative is the yang. That's the polarities of you to you, okay? What you're sending out vision is outside, is the vision cortex that you set up in the schematics and puts everything all together. Then you're bringing it to life, right? Through a 7 paradigm of a 3 graph screen, okay? Into all lines. Now that's a meta-human, okay? Not a mortality, an immortality, okay? The I stands alone until you identify what I means to you. Then you can process how you use, again, adding frames on this, adding frames on that, adding coordinations of this, adding coordinates on that, images on this, and images on that, and light location. So you don't get confused how you're adapting to your system to recognize what you always aren't. That's what you focus on. You're not here to identify. You're here to understand who you aren't, is to identify who you always are, is always, always living and always in the now. And once we get into that position, it's much easier to modify these things and get you in a lot more lines of balance, how you modify your systems all through triangulation. Okay, so I don't want anybody to get the wrong idea. Just when you're on my platform, when you're on my live, you refer me as General Sir. That's all it is. Okay, you don't reference me of who I'm not. Okay, because it's kind of like referencing something that you're in that tractions and you're not identifying, you're not in protocol. Somebody's in chain of command. You're in chain of command of yourself, but somebody has to get in lines of communication and understand these things. There is a structure, yes, but it's how you follow structure. You don't structure everybody else. You structure yourself. And that's what we all have to get into, is come into a mind of our imaginations of ourselves, not through each other, just through yourself. How you modify these things, how you listen and hear everything, get you in position how to use it through its operation, through its imagination, through its course, or anything of its setting of its recourse into that position. It's all done through activations of its travels. Now, what I mean by that is basically the more you focus on the focal point, which is everything that you're not, you get to more focus on that, because that's all you're focusing on. You're not focusing on what you need to focus on. There's nothing to focus on until you understand what you don't need to focus on. Is nothing, because you're already there. I'm existing already. So if you're existing already, that means I'm just waking to me. Now, that makes a lot more sense. And then we understand what that means to our system, right? So either I'm in positions of settings all through Dragons Andrew. Okay, that's reference of me, but you don't refer me as Andrew. You refer me as General Sir, because that's what we're in. So we're trying to get you in positions so you don't get confused in your knowledge of who you aren't and who you are, of who you always been. That's the process where it comes in chain of command. That's the process where it comes into protocol. Okay? Because you guys know too much structures of everything else, which is everyone that you're attached and tethered to. Now, once you detach, you're still attached and tethered to them, but through motion of mind. The mind collaborates everything to its imagination. You're not physically in contact unless you get in a relationship. But to identify that position, you also have to bring that through an animation to that process. How to bring the characters and understand the characteristics and the roles that they play and the players that you bring in. You're bringing an alteration of setting through a costume that you're putting through body, that you're putting through story. And it's for you to identify the film strips of what you're putting yourself into as you're waking up to yourself. And then you start creating the stories. Okay? It's much easier living the fantasies of what you always are and not understand what the fantasies that you've never been is the fiction of what you've never been. So there's always ways of looking at this, right? It's very powerful stuff, and that lines the communication system. So I don't want anybody to get confused with that. Okay, so when you're on my live in that position, you refer me, okay, as General Sir. It puts lines to everybody so they don't get confused. I'm just saying that through a reference. Okay, I don't need you to repeat that of who I'm not and who I am. I know who I am. I know where I came from, but I'm always who I am, right? That's for me, not for you. You have to find out who you aren't first. That's what you identify. And that's the more focus you focus yourself on. Now, everybody has their own ways how they focus on this. Focus in that position. You truly understand how to use the imaginations that get you in position of balance. Okay? Now, what you have to understand is how to put lines of all communication to a system, because we're in the cosmic universal line, which is a solar ground screen adaptation that's processing everything that we're not in positions of, coming back to who we really are, coming to the balance, coming into the awakening, coming into the communications of its knowledge back. Okay? But it travels on its own, see? See, it's traveling on its own. It knows what it is. It doesn't need to identify anything. So there's nothing going back. There's nothing going forward. It all depends what it's doing in settings and locations. Oh, look at that. Lost the arrow. All right. So what's happened? I drew something, but I'm identifying, did I draw it or did it draw itself? Which means it wants to be itself, which means it doesn't want to be you. It wants to be itself. So let's change position. Is it still in setting? So where's the arrow indicated, right? It doesn't want to be the arrow. It wants to be itself, right? Bring it back to fail safe. That's what it is. It doesn't want to be this. Okay, so if we put the arrow again, let's do it in the opposite side locations. All right, now I brought that in, right? That's a formation of adding frame. And then it travels all together, right? That's a collaboration. That's a partnership. I'm identifying its operation. It's running its own operation system. That's where you guys have to come in at time and measure and scale that gets you in position lines of balance that operates all your sequence, all your panels, all your operation system, all through tractions. Identifying what you are through the balance of its awareness, of its awakening to its atmospheres, of communication and collaboration, putting yourself and your knowledge at set lines of key information setting. Working all together, information lines of setting all at once, right? In your imagination. Okay? Okay, structure line, division lines, cosmic lines, interline course centers, interconnection system, all through tractions. All right, so we have to send the 4 lines of flux, 3 centers of measure, 4 centers of scale, 4 lines of sequence in the communications, right? So this is all also you identifying what you aren't, is identifying what you really are. See, everything around you is already in perfection. Everything around you is already in the now. Everything around you has always been there. So it's you have to identify everything around you is already in balance. It's you that's off balance. And that's the only way you can identify these things as who you aren't, is you're your own individual system. You are your own mind, imagination. You are your own thinking, your own thoughts, action, emotions. And this has nothing to do with anybody else. How they see you in any way inform, how they get in position lines of system and attractions, how they see you in formula or coming to this position or coming to that positions. They have to identify who they aren't first. That puts them in a position of balance. Okay? 4 settings of sequence and all lines of travel. All right? 3 ground centers, offline center, line connection setting, and convergence system, all through travel communications. All in directions all at once, right? So if it's not traveling, okay, it's off balance. So what's off balance? That's not off balance if it's already balanced itself. You're off balance. You got to find yourself how to get your frequency of balance. And that's all done through time and clocking and position lines of travel. That puts lines of 4 centers of clocking communications all at once. Constant continuous roll that rotates its system all through circulation, rotation all at once, right? It will tell you if it's not traveling, but you're the situation, not everything now that's already balanced, not everything that's already in perfection. And that's what's even more crazy. There's nothing for you guys to do. Nothing at all. You just have to perceive what you already know is who you really are, is the process, that position of soul recovery, coming into equalized core centers to its oversoul that puts every location at balance in attractions. So let's get a 4 lines of flux over screen. So 4 sequentifications, travels all together. Okay? Everything all has to travel together, right? Because that's a collaboration. You have to understand that you're running your own system, but it's running its own system at its own time, same scale, can measure balance. Setting lines of TV receptor line screens. Now, what you guys have to modify, if you want to go into your carbon base, you have to be a meta-human base, which is a 7-dimensional paradigm body into a 3-dimensional graph of thinking, right? That's what you have to process to. That's what you want to come into, right? If you want to communicate with somebody at their level, if they're not activated in screen, that's the process that you come into. Don't put yourself in position on one graph screen again, because it overrides you already existing through your organ that affects every location of you through travel. So it's important to understand how to go through that, point graphs, point calculations, point screens, point direct location setting, and travel calculation screen locations. Data formation lines of 4 lines of flux, process lines of indication, and set lines of travel. So I'm constantly doing this so you can show you exactly what's going on through a line position. Change course centers, change course of time. Is it still there? Yes. Set position lines of setting. Is it still there or is it moved? No, it's all there, so I can still travel through it, right? So I already have confirmation. It's running its own system. I'm running my own system. We're working together. It's a collaboration. It's a partnership. The highest dimension that you can reach is a partnership, but you have to start to identify who you are first, which is a 3-dimensional body itself. And that's the stories you all have to come out of, okay? In set position. All through point, all through graph, all through communication, and it rotates in all the same direction. How you circulate and formulate that is understanding how to set up primers and primers, 3 centers of travel. Again, try to constantly do that over in seconds, minutes, and hours. Make sure you're in the same panel, same operation screen. Okay, so it's going to get a lot more complicated because we're coming to higher lines of solar screen adaptation of setting through highways and travel communications. Everything comes all together. So it gets a lot more complicated as you're creating more lines of primers. That puts position location in your settings to grounds, powers, and atmospheres and set track communication and direction. Okay, but it all works together, right, in confirmation. Now, if you want to do these things, you can do a 4 center nav angles. Anything missing there? No, it's all there, right? You would know if something's missing. That means that you have to retrack, reprovision line conditions and know exactly what happened. You off frequency. Nothing's off frequency. You're off frequency. Because everything's already perfected. Everything's already balanced. There's nothing to balance. There's nothing to question. Life is not questioning. Life is always questioning and setting, which is a constant continuous flow, how it expands its own systems, how it runs its own operation system, how it runs its own prodigal system, how it runs its own prodigy system, how it runs its own mind of alteration. That's what you have to process, okay? But everything's already balanced out. It's you got to get balanced. And the only way to identify that is who you are. All right, so sending sequence lines of panel. Sending 3 screening lines, directing ground centers. Now we're going to go to formula lines, equation lines as 0 line screens, 0 1 over lines, and 0 over attractions, 0 4, and 0 8 sequence. Okay, and that line centers. So we have a division line core centers, directing ground centers, 4 lines of flux over lines. Anomaly switch lines, process lines 8 over lines of 4, in positions of 4, in position lines of 6, and 8, and 12, and 16, and 24, 48, 72, 144, over lines of 24, over lines of set position of sequence line core centers of calculation. Okay, interactions. But everything works all together through partnership. See, it all moves all together, all together, all together, all in one signal. One signal, one setting, one operation, one location. 1 1 1. Okay, so you got 4 panels and 4 sequence lines of panel, process lines of 4 panels, process lines of position, 4 line communications and convergence, 1 position lines of setting. This is where you have to process line communications because the team has to come into units how to use their geostorms, how to identify their weather, understand their summer, spring, winter, and fall, how they're coordinating that position location of seconds, minutes, and hours, and frame the clock location of systems that process your system through all levels of attractions. All right, so let's get position of 1 1 1 equals lines of 3. So position over 3, process lines indicate lines, lines set to subtract, plus line 1, process line 2, battery reline. Correlation lines, convergence system, multi attractions, direct lines of flux, direct lines of scale, sets course centers in communication setting, clocking screen locations into inhibitors over screen adaptations of pi, generation and calculation. Process of indication online conditions. Inside communication, simulation lines, which is outer space itself. All right, so this is what I created through structure. Okay? This is how it works. Now, I teleported, right? I use the telepathy of the inner core of me first, of who I am, okay? So you don't get confused what that means, okay? Who I am is the inner, okay? The inner standing, not the understanding. Understanding of you is the understanding of that's already been understood. It's knowing exactly how you travel already through pi. So for you to process these things is to understand how to see the future adaptation of you, which is on your next level, on your next scale. But you're not balancing these things out. It's already balanced. Okay? Everything around that you see is already balanced already. So it's here to give you instructions how to keep yourself in balance of what you're already in, is the now of everything that you see, interactions. Now, how you process that is how you see it through schematics, how you see it through its drawing, how you see its primer, and that position is operation. All done through the imagination. Now, once it's done through the imagination, then it comes into equation to its earth. Okay, so you took it out of animator to animation of its VR system, took it out of its consciousness, took it out of its awareness, gave it position locations, you changed position lines of attractions, you have a direct line communication lines, you use your imagination setting, you brought your alter egos in, you created lines of codification setting, you created characters and roles and players inside this position, plus also created cautions in the body that goes through story. Okay, now, okay, it's coming to life. Now, when you get in that position, you start to see everything you brought in, but you're being specific now. Specific is intent. And when you change the intent, you change the influence. You change the influence, you're changing the modification of space and time. That's taken out of the now. That's how you bring things to life, right? So you have to process how you see space and how you see time. This has nothing to do with anybody else. This all has to do with you. How you perceive things, how to bring things from outer space to inner space of you. Outer space and position, inner space of who you are, okay? All right. Changing that information system is knowing exactly how to bring these things in. Now you have to be specific of what it is and what does it mean to you, because if you don't, you won't understand the travel. Travel will recognize line communication settings. So space doesn't have to recognize you. Void doesn't have to recognize you. Time doesn't have to recognize you. You have to recognize yourselves. And you can't do that in a three-dimensional body. There's no three-dimensional time. It's all-dimensional time, okay? So once you get into that modification, it's much easier to understand how to see that and all formation lines position to its imagination setting. And then you see everything traveling all at once, all the positions all the time, right? Processing that line communication puts every line's convergence. Now it's easy to draw a structure, but it's harder to identify who I'm not, right? You can't be in a body formation lines of Earth until you understand the body formation lines of space and travel. Okay, this is the Earth. This is space. Earth, space, space, Earth. All right, two platitudes, position lines of settings, of track locations of two atoms, lines of rotation. Connecting always lines, but they're never separated. They're always inseparable. Okay, but they're always traveling, always together. Always, always together. They look like they're at a distance, but they're traveling together, right? It's just the angles how you see space and time. So nothing is left to chance. Everything that you see is just angles. There's no distance of anything until you bring that in. There's no space of anything until you bring that in. There's no sun, there's no moon, there's no clouds. There's nothing until you perceive consciousness. And the more the team and the units understands that, the more they understand how to use their imaginations and all lines, all communications saying that brings it to life and all formations to its system, all three attractions, running together as one in set position to its operation. Okay? So I'm just trying to get you guys to understand these things, because we have to understand too, is how we set the tone, how we set the lights, how we set the metaphor, okay? How we set the set position of teleportation setting, screens, adaptations of flux, understand how to come to space modulation setting, understand how to come everything a confirmation of travel, teleportation, teleweaving, teleconnection. What does it mean to you? They don't need to recognize you. You have to recognize yourselves. And you can't do that until you identify who you're not. And that's the one thing you only focus on. And the more you focus on that, I guarantee you start to release more levels of who you aren't and identify who you really are. It's the center of operation of everything in setting. It's that position. All right? You can't leave that, because that's you in the now. All you're doing is trying to stand the position of your soul recovery. Are you trying to stand locations, how you come into your grounds, powers, and atmospheres? Grounds, powers, atmospheres. Okay, that's three settings, right? Are they all traveling together? Are they all traveling together? Okay, even though it looks separated, they're not. You just think they're separated. That's what you're not understanding. So it looks like this, but this is actually like this. Okay, that's what it is. Okay? It's more powerful when you bring it into higher lines of volume. Volume puts every lines of tone, process lines of everything in measure and scale that communicates the system with the attractions. So it shows you online communication when you come in a configuration system. So it's very powerful how you can overlap the sequence, triangulations, box frames, triangulations, box frames, triangulations, box frames. In set position to its operation. It gets very confusing. Okay? But they all travel together, see? So it doesn't matter how I set the loop, it doesn't matter how I set the space, it doesn't matter how I set the time, because they know exactly where you should be, where you've always been, where you never left in space and time itself. Okay? You are in the position of mind controlling your system. You are in the controlling system how you bring things in modification. You are in control how you use yourself through animators that you are through animations. Okay? Well, that's what you see. Everybody sees different in perspective. But see, that's the beautiful thing. We're all unique. How you see things is no difference how we see, but we always see different. Now, if you want to see the same thing, you've got to have a full collaboration and partnership with yourself. Not physically lying, emotional content, right? So emotional content is understanding not through the body, but through the mind of its body of itself that brings in the projection, how it sees light and how it sees dark. Light and dark is just a metaphor, how you see light and dark. Now, if somebody comes up to you and say that it's light out, and you say, no, it's not, it's dark. I say, well, what do you mean? You look outside, it's dark. No, wait a minute. Where's the light? There's got to be light and dark. Or if there's no light and dark, there's no light, shades, and shadows. It's that position. Okay? Light, shades, and shadows. Okay? And then it moves on its own. Okay? So let's color that in. Okay? So everything communicates to the system, mutates to any lines of frequencies, and set lines of communications. Now you really have to set the tone, you have to set the frequencies, and you have to set the time of what you're doing in position of light, shades, and shadows and traction. Okay, so that's going to be dark. Okay, and let's bring in the set position lines and calculation screens. Okay, now I'm just going to bring in the shades. Okay. It shows you the bandwidth, it shows you the length. It's very powerful how you see that position. Right? And let's just get a little bit lighter. And bring that in. So it's 3 colors of shade and 1 shadow and frame. Okay? So you're creating volume, you're creating mass. And now for you understand that as longitude and latitude, right? So longitude and latitude is you're going out of space, out of mind, out of sync, out of balance. Out of balance. Okay, so you're jumping into another ocean, not the ocean that you already identify. Okay, so it's important you understand how to see that in fractals. I see that in that position, so you don't see that in separation. All right, so let's go over lines of recourse and 3 centers of travel. Okay, inside communication lines of 4 centers, line communication lines, high direct location of travel. Okay, so that indicates actually it's coming this way. All right, light, stage, and shadows, 1/3 grounds is that position of locations. Okay, and then you got a little bit of this in setting. Okay, so there's a lot of ways you can see it, but the sun directory has to be in the right location of setting. Okay, so it can spawn off in its directions, in its locations, all in set position of its operation. Okay, sets a wind tunnel and relies on high position of its travels in that communications. Now we change the course of time, you change the lines of screen adaptations of flux. Different structure, different design, right? Okay, but they all travel. They never stop traveling, see? They're always traveling, but they're always changing themselves, all right, through roots, measure, and scale, all right? Process of indication here, there's Saturn. Saturn rotates its setting, location of its systems, calculate 3 centers of grounds on a line center. See, I created a whole new structure of design, but I never get out of the equations of creating, just constantly creating, constantly creating, all the time. But everything has to be traveling. If it's not traveling, you're off. They're not off. And when I say they're not off, you're not in position of balance with yourself. This has nothing to do with everything else, because everything around you is in perfection. It's you that's off balance. It's you not understanding your formula. It's you not understanding your equations. They're not here to identify you. You're here to identify who you always are, is what you've always been in, is the VR itself, to understand how to see yourself as your own animator that you are through animations. And bringing that to life brings you into the now, like this, just like everybody else. Process of indication setting, all 3 tractions, all 3 locations. Look at this in set position, it's operation. Okay, so let's colorate that line. Process of indication inside tractions and directions, off the locations. So you're constantly creating stories, guys, in your minds, in your collaboration, in your thoughts. Even when you're not even creating thoughts, it doesn't matter. But are you processing that thoughts are already created in your mind? Or are you identifying that you're not in position of the mind itself? You don't realize you're in confusion. There's nothing to be confused of. You're already in that setting. So you have to identify your thoughts and your action emotions are already set up in that position of operation. Okay? And then you can put yourself in some positions here, attractions. That's you. It's that communication. So what you're doing is just constantly understanding more levels of you in the imagination itself. Okay, and then you formulate and simulate yourself, change your lines of communication, change your graph screens, go through red of indication inside lines, change the intelligent information system and traction. Okay, and then you can basically go with that positions, travel this lines of indication, lines of set position to its operation. Okay, so it's amazing what you can do in your imagination of travel, how you come into the expanding of your system. So you don't want to leave colorations to chance. You want to color it in, right? Because it's not done. There's no direction, there's no operation, there's no network. So it's kind of like you ran out of ink or you ran out of color in that position. So it's constantly keep going and keep creating, but you have to identify what you're creating through frequencies. You can't leave anything open Everything has to be in positions. But you have to understand what you've already done through precogging, where you're in position. You're overriding your sequence every time you're thinking, every time you're saying something to yourselves, to each other. You're overanalyzing. You don't need to analyze anything. All you have to do is observe everything that's already done through its equations. And then once you understand you've always been in the simulation of the VR system, that you never left. Puts everything all together in balance of communications, all through attractions, all through location. Okay? See the reflection? From that to this, see? Light, stage, and shadows. And if you look around in positions, you can see the intelligence of formation. See? The eyes, the nose, right? So there's light, shades, and shadows everywhere you go, a structure of design line. Okay? So you can't make any mistakes because it's already created. But what you created never was created in the first place. That's the clutter you got to let go. Now, what you have to understand, by letting go is to embrace it. Okay? Not pushing it away, formulating it. Understand what you're doing. Understand what you did is understand what you're doing now. It's just expanding, exploring, and evolving yourself. How you do that is who you always are, living in the VR system, understanding that you've never left the VR system. You've always been there in the now. And it's a repeating cycle that you always have to be in all the time. Now, there is no time until you create time. There is no space until you create space. And that's what makes it magical. How you process that is how you bring things in animation of outer space. To bring the lines in position, how you bring it in real time, that's how it is in set position. Okay? You're bringing things to life out of its animation in set fractions. Now, I'm in observation. If I set intent, you'll see this. Wherever you go. The structure of this, the colors, the lights, it doesn't matter because I get specific. Getting specific is certain lines of communication out of online position, how you see through all of it's descriptive or all of it's imagination. Adding lines, adding frames, adding communication, adding seconds, adding minutes, adding hours, and that positions. It's all levels that set position of your thoughts, action, emotions that you've already done through this equation. Okay? So again, you're here to identify who you really aren't. And that's what you focus on. Because if you're not focusing on something particular, what are you focusing on? What do you want to focus on? Is who you aren't. Because it doesn't make any sense if you're trying to focus on who you are. You're not identifying that. You have to identify everything that you're not. And once you come into the soul recovery, to the oversoul, all it is embracing everything at its frequencies so you can be comfortable, so you can live as cycles and recognize everything you're doing. You're not reconstructing. You're embracing and evolving yourselves. Already knowing what you've already done through pi, which the body constantly goes through every time it sees itself, doesn't have to identify itself. So your body goes so fast in the mind, but everything goes so fast in the mind itself. What we have to understand is how to control our mind of what we're doing through the alterations and through the bodies of what we put ourselves into in that position of its cautions and the stories that we go through. But every time we wake up, we are waking up to ourself. Nothing else, nothing more. There's no story, there's no alteration, there's nothing, nada. Which means you are just observing everything that's running its own operation. As you're just observing and watching. Which is the most beautiful thing. And that's all it is. Until you bring something in. That's what changes the alterations of the now. But you have to control yourself already being in the now. So I want to make that very well clear. So you do not get confused of why you're here. Okay? It's not why you're here. It's why you're not here. Because you're not here because you're already identified there. You've always been here. There's always ways to the psychological system of a reset. All through attractions, all through locations, all through its operation. Okay, so this is this. It's imagination. Isn't that amazing? Isn't that incredible? How you see this in light, shades, and shadows? It's incredible when you see it in that position. So it has a direct link, how we modify this and how we understand this and understand our settings, how we see ourselves in dimensional beings of light and how we see ourselves in metaphors of dimensional beings of light, how we see our coloration tones, how do we see our pattern recognition tones, how we see our patterns of behavior. For us to really understand is how to see it in collaboration and partnership. How you see this to this through its shadow, lights, and shades. Okay? All right, now I can turn this into a different color. Let's fade it out in position. Okay, now I've overlapped in the sequence. Now I'm adding time frame. Okay, so I'm not in the now. I'm creating new, but I'm always identified the now. The now is just basically where you are, not where you're going to be next. So what you identify, you can't get out of the now, because that's you always the now itself, which is your inner and your outer space, which is one. That's the now itself, interactions, right? But I'm changing this into water now, right? And then, you know, you can use your imaginations and setting, drippings, all through tractions, all through connections, all through the set position locations, right? There's nothing you can't do through your mind, but you have to process what you already know through the mind. See, that's where you guys get very confused, because you don't understand how to adapt to your thoughts, action, emotions. You're not realizing they're already been set locations. You don't realize there's no teleportation wave because it's already set to its teleportation wave. So you're repeating yourself over and over and over. And that's how you can't get out of who you are, until you get out of the thoughts, action, emotion that's already been set up for who you are. So don't get confused with that settings. Okay? So when I change the structure of design, it changes everything to schematics. Okay? A structure. But it all travels all together. Okay? It's very powerful stuff, I'm telling you. Then I can move on to the next frame. Set position those locations. All through tractions, all through location. Okay? It's amazing once you adapt and understand how to set anything you want and frame anything you want in that position. But you're always identifying, you're always in the now of its VR system. Okay? You can have yourself overlooking the panel right here. Okay? That's you overlooking right there. All right, see next 10,000 going by. Okay? Right? Traveling by, zipping through in the skyline. Okay? And then it comes to you. All right? It's how you use your imaginations, guys. But you have to process your thoughts, action, emotions. It's already done through its equation of structure, of design, through space and time. Okay? So as it's coming to you, it teleports you. All right? So it takes you and teleports you. Right? And picks you up, right? Okay? All right? Process of communication system, all through tractions and directions. And when you come to that level, you disappear in setting inside the ship. That's you in the ship. Okay? So, and then it travels. Now I can travel wherever it wants. You know, I can go from any angle, any point. 3 centers of angles, 4 centers of communication with systems. All right? So it's amazing what you do through your minds, guys. It's absolutely incredible. But look at the bandwidth and the longitude and latitude that you can keep creating over and over and over again. And that's just working from inside line centers in set position. Look at the bandwidth that you can use. Look at the creation you can still open up with through the mind itself. And you can't identify that until you understand your thoughts, your actions, or your emotions are already done through its equation through pi. But that's what your body has to process through. And the more you process yourself, the more you identify yourself. Then you start to indicate, wow, I'm recognizing who I never was. And I start to recognize, I'd rather live a fantasy of who I always am than recognize a fantasy of who I never was. That is all lines of fact and not fiction. Now, how you see fact is how you see fiction. How you see fiction is how you see fact. That's the coordinates of you. This has nothing to do with anybody else. You have to follow your own system. That's the only way you guys are going to get out of what you aren't. Identify what you always are. Is the mass of nothing that process everything in settings and position. Okay? So once you get in that position, you can change formation lines of space of time. Different structure, different design line. You can have yourself in the simulation lines. Subtractions. Okay? You're here. Okay? That's what you have to identify. Where's your body going to be in this particular time of day? It's going to be there, right? Okay? And you're here observing what you already see, what you already done. So you're just observing everything that's already there. All right? So you're just watching, right? But you're watching the body going where it needs to go. So you don't get confused through time and space in that position. Okay? And then it meets a friend. Hey, what's up? You brought it in, right? But you know what you're doing. If you don't know what you're doing, it takes over your system. See how easy that was to be taken over? So, try to understand that position. So, in that location setting, to understand your track location, so I'm not going to take you over. There's its vessel, right? Or there's its vessel, right? Picking you up. Taken to its planet. Okay? And now you're inside. You're inside. You don't know what to do. Oh, what do I do now? I'm lost. I'm confused, right? So it's all story. But you don't start as a story. You start yourself in a story. Graphing through a story. Understanding the story of you is waking up to you of the stories that you keep creating and the alterations. Okay, and the egos. Oh, egos. Ooh. Egos are a lot of fun because you don't understand the ego until you understand the ego itself, which is the void. Everything lines, position, location, how you see the coloration lines of space of time is a process lines of 4 grounds, 4 sequence, 4 core centers of the calculation. Okay, process lines embedding over screen, 3, set, 6 lines of set position and setting. Okay, indicates all travels all together. All right, process of indication setting, change time frame, line position locations, comes in position of its dimensional doors. All right, all in set, all in sequence. Okay, doors. All right, process lines, ceilings, interaction, and locations. Just the ceiling itself. Okay, coming down and setting. Right? Okay. And bring more bandwidth, right? Bring more. Okay. So you have to understand the inner core center of you first. That puts you in always of the now. The body's always in the now. But what you have to process is the respective position, which is the void itself, that you have to start identifying. Nothing around you doesn't need to identify you, especially now because they're on their own. They're here to help you and guide you and give you instructions, but nothing else. You have to identify yourself. That's how you identify what you aren't, is identify what you always are. It's always been imperfection. And that position lines attractions. Okay? So that helps you in all ways and forms, how you see space, how you see time, or anything that you embedded your systems and its lines of calculations. Knowing exactly, you're just having fun, just doing anything in a line position with travel. Okay? Simplifies. But it's knowing exactly what you're doing first. So as soon as you understand you are the animator to the animation, you're processing outer space, identifying you of the inner space of who you are, which is the now. Okay? Now what you have to understand is what you're receiving. And what you're receiving, okay, is what? What are you receiving? Information, data, processing that, trying to understand the download, trying to understand the upgrade, uplinking. See, when you guys touch things, that's giving you instructions. How to touch it on the right or how to touch it on the left. It doesn't like the line positions. It doesn't want your thumb over its position. It doesn't like the thumb over this position. It doesn't like to be held like this. It wants to be like this. As I take my right hand, process in position location to its setting. Right over left, not left over right. I can do this line positions, all through tractions and locations, but it prefers me in that lines of screen. Now, everything that we draw is just a vision lines to its energy, location to its setting, to its space facade. It's intelligence. See, I did it with my left hand, right? It's tricky. So if you're ambidextrous, you should be able to understand how to do these things. See, The one thing you're not understanding through body frame is that you limit yourself every single time you get into your thoughts of thinking. Okay, so let's get a position of an iron bar. Okay, and that's where it comes in a 12-minute video where I was showing you you can't bend it, but there is a possibility that you can, and there is a possibility that you can't. But what you have to stand in your mind, you can do anything. You can bend anything. That's why there's no spoon, right? But how you see the spoon, okay, is not how you see the spoon. It's how you see the perception of the spoon, okay? You're bending the space. Your body is bending, right? But you're doing it through the mind of collaboration of imagination, right? So the spoon isn't bending, you're bending. And it's how you perceive through its story and how a spoon is bending. You're in mind control of that. And you see it through imagination and you see it through perspective. That's how you bend a spoon in that position. Now, as my left hand, all through attractions, all through location with systems. So it processes lines of indication setting, all through calculation lines of screen locations. Okay? Now, when you draw somebody, it's just a feeling. It's just the energy. Okay? So let's get a frame, position lines of setting, process line communication with convergence, setting travels, point lines of graph, directing inside line communication with position. All right? That's me in structure. All right? Focusing. Focus. But I don't focus on the phone. I focus beyond the phone. I don't look at things. I look beyond things. So that's how we have to start seeing perspective. And then we see the volume and mass and set position locations all through track location. How we see things, guys. How we perceive consciousness. Perceiving consciousness is complicated, okay? Especially if it's out of range. Let's say it's out of range, okay? So you got the set position location. So there's nothing there, nothing at all. It's just you itself, nothing else, right? Nothing's coming to mind, nothing's coming to frame, nothing's coming to imagination setting. Just you, right? That's just you, right? So you brought 4 settings. You brought north, east, west, and south. Now, if there wasn't there, it was never there in the first place, which means you are just the empty space of all 4 settings of traction. Okay, process you and your data, and process calculation, your position, your Merkaba test, or architecture region. Now, what you have to start indicating, are you bringing in south, are you bringing in east, north, or west? Are you bringing all set position all at once? You decide. You're in the controlling system. How you bring things in through its data of communication. All through traction, all locations, right? All right, so you brought in a star direction of the box frame. Triangulation lines, flux over 3. Process lines of indication lines of 3 over 6. Set course centers and projections over screen. That's what you brought in. Now, that's still outer space. Outer space, structure line division locations. You know exactly what you brought in, position, location, setting. Now, it comes on its earth. Check this out. This might blow your system. Guess what you brought in? On the earth in real time, a crop circle. You created through the vision of outer space, comes down to the earth in structure of its inner space. There's the earth, there's the crop circle that you created. All through your mind imagination in box of triangulation frame. Okay? That's what you have to modify. That's what you have to understand to be understood. Okay? And that's how you bring things to life through an animation to its earth of its reality in real time. Okay? That's how you bring in from here to here. Okay? 2 provisions and cycles, vortex of design line, in your cortex, in your mystical cortex, a set design through codification. Process you, how you bring in your formula, how you bring in your equations. Well, there's proof right there. Flux over lines, alphabetical lines of outer space, alphabetical lines of earth space. There's your crop circle on your earth and set design in real time. Okay? So, but you have to understand the formula equations to it. You have to understand how to set up the image to it. Understand it through its animation. I understand that you are doing it from the VR system. You've always been in the VR system. You never left the virtual reality. But you have to understand how to see yourself as an animator to an animation that you've already mastered everything already in your imagination. So it's very confusing when you guys are thinking or when you come in your thoughts not realizing you're overthinking because that's overriding what you already know. So you're repeating what you already said. That's what you're understanding, right? Until you identify yourself, you're always in the now. And that's going to keep going and going and going and going until you understand yourself. And for you to understand in that position is to understand who you aren't. And who you aren't. That all comes to fruition of light. And how you see that is all directory in line communication setting to positions. So what you get in position of is just waking up to yourself. And then you go on with the day. Then you go with the alteration. Then you create the alteration egos. Then you create the costumes. Then you create the stories. You don't have to create anything at all. You can just be in the mind of silence. You can just be listening to music. But look at things one at a time. Stop overanalyzing everything of thoughts, action, emotions. Stop trying to figure things out. Start to recognize of what you aren't first. Is everything else. Is everything else of everyone in that position. And that's what you have to modify in positions of. And that's the only way you can get in positions of who you are individually. You come in your own thinking, your own thoughts, your own actions, and your own emotions of creating new. So you can understand why your body is here for you to understand, because it's already done everything through pi. So if the body's done everything through pi, and the vision of cortex is already done through its imagination of pi, that means you have to get out of that. So you can process yourself is to change all those frequencies into teleportation of light. Now, when you get into that, you liquefy the line position of carbon, line center locations, center lines of silicone, driving ground core centers, crystalline over line screen adaptation, process lines of transitions. It's got line signals, transitions over screen, truth, false, 3 centers of travel, process lines of indication setting. Okay, so it's space coding and direct lines of communication. That's space coding. Space coding is a lot more confusion, but you have the adaptation setting the set the location system because you see it through a brain graph and set tractions off the locations. Okay, indicate position of space lines, sets core centers and calculation screens. L line tracks right over left. Okay, up line left over right. There's the box frame. So you coordinate position lines of setting to bring the circulation lines to position of 0. Change the inventories and frame lines and communication lines of service. That puts time calculation screen location to the system. All right. So you bring that in, change information lines of setting, structure line communication with laser and line communication. Calculate and modify transits over line and line core centers, directing screen lines of set lines of sequence. 3 ground centers, high line communication convergence system, all through traction. XC thousands. Apply to line position, mothership, and set travel. Okay. Set core centers, calculate lines, command each ship over lines of docking, station, base station, hangar 8, and set calculation. Directing ground centers on sequence in pi and track communication. Convergence system, calculate and modify, earth line, process lines indication. So all I'm doing is I'm putting paint by number together, transits over lines, triangulation over flux, out signal lines, outside lines of travel, over lines of pi and directions, directing ground centers on the sequence, on pi travel and correlation communication. Directing ground centers on sequence in communication lines of flux, in rotation lines and calculation screen locations. Okay, it's on tractions, right? So it's what you do through animation brings things to life. But you have to modify the character, you have to modify the role of the character and the characteristics of what it's playing through its alteration of its ego. Now, once you modify that, it's much easier to say it in space modulation and understand how you create it through the animator that you are through animation. All you're doing is bringing things to life. But you have the process that you've always been in the VR system. And for you to understand that is your imagination. Okay? That's the only way you guys are going to understand who you aren't, of who you really are, is that position of travel. Okay? Now, everything I'm doing is observation, but you're seeing it through travel. Okay? Because remember, I'm at my frequency. So you're seeing a time generation of me and a timeline for you to understand. You're not seeing me where I am. You're seeing where you see me in your time lineage. And that communications, we already had these conversations. So you don't want to keep going having ongoing conversation because it affects you already done through pi. And that's what you have to understand through process. Now understand that position, your foundation, changes timelines of the cosmos. The cosmos is an interact location interlinking that processes your setting to a surfacing engine. Everything processes its own engine. Everything runs its own engine. Now, if you're not in a position of balance, you're not in operation of its time of balance. You have to clock your system and have foundation lines of grounds, powers, and atmospheres, and be consciously aware of who is running and what is running who. And if you understand that position, so either you're running on empty or you're not understanding your set position. Okay? It's all of your foundations that put you in equalized settings into the existing, all levels of existing, living the intelligence of forever existing, all levels of the now. Of the now change me in not position locations, how I see space, and how I see time and scale. It's all its interactions. Nothing else, nothing more. Okay? But it's very interesting how we bring things to life from outer space, from inner space of who I am. Bring it on my earth, first through structure, then through design, through operation, balance of communications, all through instruction. Okay? Structure of outer space, modifications in position inner space. Okay? Set position, operation setting earth in real time. Okay? So that should help you understand a little bit more in set position locations and settings. Okay? See you in 5.